Second episode of building a game with Rust and Bevy. So last time we had our little Ferris, we made it move with the keyboards, and then we had our first laser system. In this episode, we're going to make it 2 lasers, scale it correctly, have the enemies, and have the collision with the explosions. Okay, so now let's do kind of 2 lasers on each little clause. So we could copy paste here the code here, but that would be pretty lame. So what we're going to do is create a closure. And so like this, we can capture the other states and just focusing on the offset. So what we're going to do here is going to do a let mute, the variable here, which will be the variable for our closure, spawn lasers. And then the only argument that we need is going to be the X offset here. And we're going to move all of this guy here like that. And then in the X, we're going to add the offset. It's an assignment, so it's a statement, is not an expression. We put the semicolon. And we're going to compute our F offset. So it would be 144, which is the width of our Ferris, divided by 4. We divide by 2, and then another 2 because we have the half scale. And then we're going to do minus 5. So this is what I found here that works well for the little clause. And then we do the spawn lasers, our closure, and we just do X offset. And then we're going to do another one with a minus offset. Press save, everything seems to be okay. We do a cargo run. And now we have our 2 lasers and they come pretty nicely. That's pretty cool. Anyway, so that's good for this one. So now is a good time to do the refactoring and to use a Bevy plugin system here. So we are going to refactor all of the player system into its own file. So we're going to collapse everything. And then we're going to take all of the player system here, and we're going to put them in a file, which will be player.rs. And then we go to main, and we're going to do the mod player to include that. And for now, we're going to use all of this here. We're going to press save to save both files. There's going to be a bunch of errors, but it's okay. And we do the command dot here. And then that's it. So now if we go to the player here, RS, obviously in the setup here, there's all these errors. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to copy that. After our system here is going to be add plugin, player plugin. And we're going to create our plugin. So just a pub struct player plugin. And then we're going to implement plugin for player plugin. And that is just one method, fn build app mutable app builder. And then here, we're going to add all of our app here. Press save. We need semicolon here. And then the only thing that we need here is for this one. Seems to be okay. We do a cargo run, and then that's it. Pretty cool. So there's going to be another one here that we're going to do. We're going to take this opportunity as well. We're going to comment this one out. Press save. And we have only one guy here. So for this property, we're just going to allow to be unused, which is fine. And then that's it. We refactor the code, clean and tight. Okay, so now let's create our enemy. So first we're going to create the sprite here. Then our materials, which will be the enemy, same type obviously. And then on the resource, we're going to have a resource here, struct, that will store the active enemies on stage. And that will allow us to not overspawn enemies into the stage. Then after, as a component, obviously, we're going to have our struct enemy. And then here we're going to insert our resource that we created earlier, active enemies, and obviously start at 0. And then we will actually create a plugin as well to be similar to the player code layout. So enemy plugin, we'll create that later. And then in the commands here, obviously, we're going to create our enemy sprite. Okay, press save. we have one error here, which kind of makes sense. So now we're going to create our enemy file here. So enemy.rs. In the main file, we're going to do a mod enemy to import this module. And now create our struct enemy plugin. And we're going to implement our Bevy plugin for enemy plugin. Then we're going to implement the function here. And we're going to do app. And here's a little trick here. So what we want is spawn the enemy every second. We don't want to spawn too fast. Yeah. So for that, we're going to add a system set, which is basically two systems. We use a system set new from Bevy. And the first one here would be with run criteria. So that will dictate when to run the system. And we're going to use a fixed time step from Bevy, step 1 second. And then in the system set with system, and that is our system, and that would be our enemy spawn that we're going to create just now. And that will create our system here. So now we can do our fn, enemy spawn. We can go to the main here actually, and we can solve this compile error here just by command dot, import enemy plugin, press save. So now we have our mute commands like usual. We have our mute active enemies, and that will need to be a mutable resource because we're going to add one, obviously. And then we have our win size because we need to place the enemy somewhere in the windows, and that will be a resource win size. And that doesn't need to be mutable. And then the materials, res materials. So we're going to do if active enemies is less than 1, we're going to spawn the enemy. But before that, we need to compute the random position. And this is where we're going to use a random, such as we take the window size, divide by 2, make some padding on each side, and that would be our range here. So like this, it will be somewhere more or less in the middle of the screen. Make sure to import everything here. So now what we want is spawn the enemy, like what we did before. We are doing a command spawn, the sprite bundle, the materials here, we don't forget to clone. The translation with the XYs that we have over here, the scale, which actually this should be scale, command dot, and that could be one to be consistent with the rest. And then we have the default, and then we insert the enemy here. That is inside our crate. And then last, we're going to increment the active enemies count by 1. Press save. Even the warnings are gone. So we're going to do a cargo run. And we get our enemy. And then obviously if we show it here, our enemy is kind of like a ghost, which kind of makes sense. We didn't do the collision yet. Okay, so let's do that. Okay, so now that is where things becomes pretty fast here. So to do the laser hit with the enemy here, we just go to main. We're going to collapse everything. And then we add system laser hit enemy. And for now, we're going to have that in the main.rs. Later, we can refactor it somewhere. And then after, we just go down and create our fn laser hit enemy, a mute commands, because we're going to have to delete entities. Then we're going to have 2 queries. One is for laser, and we'll have our entity, the transform component, the sprite, and then we're going to have with laser, make sure that we get the laser. And then we're going to have a similar query here for the enemy. And finally, we're going to have the mute active enemies, which is our active enemy count. Okay, press save to make sure everything goes okay. Looks good so far. Okay, so now let's go and add our function body here. We are going to first have the 2 for loop. So the first one is going to be through the lasers. So here we're going to deconstruct the tuple from the query. So we're going to take the laser entity, laser transform, laser sprite, and then the with laser we don't really care, obviously. And then we do a laser query, intermute. And then we're going to do the same thing here for the enemy within. Press save, making sure everything is fine. And then what we're going to use here for the comparison is a function that is called collide. And for collide, you give the position and the size of the sprite. And the size of the sprite needs to be multiplied by the scale. And the scale is a vector of 3, but we need to have a vector of 2 because the size is a vector of 2. So for that, we're going to do let laser scale equal vec2 from laser transform scale. Then we do the same for the enemy. And now we can do the collision. So we're going to do the let collision equal collide. So that is a method here from Bevy. And then we're going to have our laser transform translation, which is basically our position. Then we're going to have our laser sprite dot size, and that is a value that we're going to multiply by our laser underscore scale. And so it had to be a vector of 2. And then we're going to do the same thing here for the enemy. And then we're just going to do a if let sum. We don't really care about the value collision. So if collision is not none, so there is a collision, we're going to remove the enemy by doing a commands.entity, and that will be the enemy entity. And we're going to do a despawn here. We don't forget to decrease our enemy count. And then we remove the laser. So the same one as this guy, but obviously with laser. Press save, everything should be fine. And we are going to do a cargo run. We get our Ferris, left, right, 2 lasers, and boom. Pretty cool. That is awesome. Anyway, okay, so now that is pretty cool, and we're going to work on the explosion now. So the first things we're going to do is going to back on top here, and then we're going to add our explosion sprite sheets here. And then that would be this file here, which is going to be a 64 by 64 here with all of the explosion sprite. So we're going to go back here, PNG. Then in our resource here, we're going to add an explosion, and it will be a handle, but this time is a texture atlas handle. And then in the components, we're going to add 2 components. The first one is going to be the explosion. And the second one is going to be actually not a sprite that we're going to display, but more kind of an order of saying, please display an explosion at this place. And that is going to be a tuple struct of a vec3. Then here we're going to create a new system, and we're going to add it, which is going to be our explosion to spawn. So it's a little level of indirection, but it's going to help a lot. The next things we need to do here is in the setup, now we need to build the new materials here, the explosion sprite. And so what we need to do here is add what is called a texture atlas. And that will allow to have our sprite sheets with all of the different elements. So the way we do that with our asset server, with explosion sheet, so the same way that we create the sprite here, but then we create another struct here, which is a texture atlas from a grid is 64 by 64, that is each of the sprite side, and we have a 4 by 4 grid. Then the materials here, which is now we do the explosion and we just add a texture atlas to it. Then what we're going to do here is when we do the laser hit here, after the remove, spawn, explosion, spawn. And here we don't need to have the sprites and all of the things that we usually have. We just spawn a new blank entity in a way, and then we insert the component, which is the explosion to spawn, with the position of the enemy. And obviously we clone it because this needs to own it. So now that we have that, we can add our system here, and our system explosion to spawn will take a mute command, the query here, which will be the entity and the explosion to spawn, and then the materials here that we have, such as we can get our material for the explosion. And here we're going to iterate through the entities, so that will allow us to have more explosion per frame if we needed to. And then for each explosion to spawn, what we're going to do here is we're going to spawn a sprite sheet bundle, with a material explosion, we clone it, texture atlas, the transform, which will be the position, and then we insert our strut here. And then obviously we don't forget to despawn the explosion spawn entity, because otherwise it will keep spawning. And we press save, it should be okay. And then here we go here, cargo run. And now we should have the explosion. So now obviously it's not fully finished. We only see the first frame because we don't animate the explosion yet. So we just show the top left image here, this one. Okay? So what we want is to animate through all of this. So to do that, let's stop this first. So to animate the explosion, we're going to go back on top here on our setup. We're going to add a system, which is going to be animate explosion.system. And then we're going to create our function here. And first here, when we are going to insert here the explosion, we're going to insert a new component, which is going to be a timer. And that will be a timer attached to this explosion, which will allow us to animate the thing later. And so here we are going to do a timer from seconds, and we are going to give it 0.5, which is basically 50 milliseconds. And here we set true. And so now here in the animate explosion, we're going to have our mute commands, the time here, which is a resource from the last frame. And so that will allow us to do the animation. And then we have the texture atlas here that we need. We don't need the mutable, but that we need to be able to animate here. And then we're going to have our query, which is our entity, which will be our explosion. The timer, which is this guy here. The texture atlas sprite, because again, we're going to need this. And then after the handle to the atlas, and then the with explosion here. So now we go back down. The first thing we're going to go is iterate through all of this. So again, that will allow us to have multiple explosions in the same frame. So that's very powerful. And then the trick here is a timer object that is attached to the entity. We're going to tick it with a time delta. So the time delta is the duration from the last frame. And the tick here will remove this delta to the timer, which is our 50 milliseconds. And then what we do is if timer is finished, then this means that we can move one square. So again, here, if we look at our explosion, every 50 milliseconds, we're going to show this one, and this one, this one, this one, this one, this one, and so on. So that is what is going to happen here. And then once it's finished, it's going to reset it. And then next time it will tick until it hit the 50 millisecond mark. So then after, what we're going to do is from the sprite here, we're going to increase the index. And again here, what he will do here, the index is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and so on. And so that will increase the index, and that will display the right thing on the screen. Now, obviously, we don't want to place that to the infinite. So if the sprite index is equal the texture atlas textures length, and then we are going to have a commands entity, and that is the reason why we had our explosion entity here, and we're going to despawn. And then we should be able to do a cargo run. And that's pretty cool. That's it. So everything works beautifully. And that will be it for this episode. Next one, we're going to see how to make moves the enemies, and eventually we are going to do enemy fleets as well. Until next one, happy coding.